Okay, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Ali Nabavizadeh. I'm a assistant professor at Cooper Medical School of Rowan University. But my research is in the cranial mechanics and musculature in herbivorous dinosaurs. And today I'm just going to be talking about what my research is all about, what I've done, what I did for my dissertation and a few years ago, and how that's carried on. Feel free to ask questions. I can't guarantee I'll get to any of them, but if there is time at the end, I'll try to answer a couple, but I'm so sorry if I don't. I tend to talk, so maybe I'm wondering if it might go long. But so I'm just going to get started. So here I am in the hat, looking out in the field, looking at dinosaur facial anatomy. No, I wish that was me. I wish I could do something like that. That would be amazing. But basically, ever since undergrad, I've been interested in the anatomy of the dinosaur head, specifically herbivores, and basically looking at what their muscles might have looked like on the inside. And unfortunately, we can't dissect dinosaurs today, obviously, because they've been, these Ornithischian dinosaurs and dinosaurs that are not birds, essentially. So we have to look at the bones and look at muscle scarring and things like that. I'm going to try to take this off. It might help me. I'm sorry. So paleontologists have been trying to reconstruct cranial musculature and just like generally look at the mechanics of dinosaur heads ever since the 1800s. And specifically, Dullo in 1884 was probably about one of the first to really reconstruct musculature, or at least talk about what the head musculature would have been like in different dinosaurs. So he basically broke it down into two different categories, and now we know it's a lot more complicated than this, but I'll just talk about it to give you a broad view. So first one is the Crocodilian muscular condition. This is basically the condition where the sauropods and theropods, so this is a sauropod here, and I'll show you what it looks like in a second. These are the long-necked sauropods, and these are carnivorous theropods. These two types of dinosaurs, Dullo mentioned that they had relatively weak temporal muscles, so muscles in just behind the orbits right here, just caudal to the orbit, but much larger palatal muscles, basically big muscles that stretched from the palate underneath the cranium and wrapped around underneath the mandible into this big attachment site. And the same here, you can see this big attachment site that might have been present in theropod dinosaurs. Conversely, for things like ornithopods that are herbivores, they were considered to be the, quote, lizard-like muscular condition, which is basically the reverse of the crocodilian muscular condition. That way, that means things like larger temporal muscles, so this temporal region of the temple is much longer for backward rostrocaudally, and as well as weaker palatal muscles. So there's very little room for attachment for the palatal muscles in smaller palates in general. Now we know it's a lot more complicated than this, but this was kind of a basic framework that many paleontologists have kind of, worked off of for the past century, basically, especially most in the past 2 or 3 decades. So today we use a method known as extant phylogenetic bracketing, and this was coined by Dr. Larry Whitmer in 1995, and this is basically a method in which basically we used living animals to kind of elucidate what dinosaurs might have looked like. And luckily, we have many types of birds, and birds are dinosaurs themselves. They are an offshoot of theropod dinosaurs, and therefore, because there are birds, we can dissect them and kind of get a feel for what dinosaurs' jaw muscles, at least the attachment sites, or get a relative idea of where their attachment sites might have been. We also can look at crocodilians, like this alligator, Crocodilians are archosaurs, as are dinosaurs and into birds. So they also give us a good idea as to what their muscles might have looked like. And also, we can look at things like lizards and turtles, which are kind of further or more distantly related. But all of these kind of give us clues as to what dinosaur jaw musculature architecture would have looked like. So I'm not going to talk a lot about carnivorous theropods. I've only got a couple of slides on them because my research is in herbivores, but I wanted to highlight them really quick. And just to show you, there have been many studies in cranial mechanics in theropod dinosaurs, specifically Tyrannosaurus Rex, the very famous animal that we all know and love. And Tyrannosaurus Rex especially has these gargantuan jaw muscles, temporal and palatal. They just have this enormous jaw power in which they're able to crunch down on their prey and break bone. But here you can see these are the temporal muscles. They originate here along the upper margin of this is called the supratemporal bar, and they stretch down and attach onto the coronoid eminence of the mandible, basically the part of the upper region of the mandible that's behind the teeth, caudal to the teeth here. And then the palatal muscles, you can see, this is a view from behind. See these palatal muscles wrapping around and attaching along here. And a lot of people reconstruct this muscle to stretch way up to kind of insert close to where this temporal muscle is attached. So you can get a feel for how just massive these muscles are in these animals. And there have been, like I said, tons of studies in carnivore mechanics or cranial mechanics, not only with just the muscles, but looking at strains within the bones. So these right here are examples of studies in what's known as finite element analysis. Basically, for instance, here in Rayfield et al. In 2001, they break down the skull into in the computer software into really tiny triangles, and these triangles kind of you can make them push against each other in certain ways with certain pressures, imitating what a bite of a dinosaur may have been like. And with that simulation, you can see the cascade of forces running through the skull. And these are just examples of what the output of those studies. So the cooler the color, the less strain there is. The warmer the color, the more strain there is in that region of the skull. So you can kind of start to understand where those forces are kind of perpetuating throughout the skull. There's also a method called multibody dynamics analysis, in which you can actually simulate the muscles themselves working on the bone to see, look at leverage of the muscles to help with understanding bite force and so on and so forth. So lots of studies. Now, my studies are in Ornithischian dinosaurs. Basically, that it involves all of these animals on this side of this tree. So over here we have Sariskians, which have traditionally been known to consist of theropods and sauropotamorphs, although a recent study by Barron et al. Has kind of given us another look at this and kind of has postulated that, well, maybe theropods are actually closer to Ornithischians, creating a clade called Ornithocelia. I'm not going to go into that, but what we're focusing on here is the Ornithischian dinosaurs. And Ornithischian dinosaurs consist of a huge range of morphologies in their heads and in the bodies. Anywhere from stegosaurs with tiny heads but enormous plates on their back, spikes on their tail and bodies depending on the species. There's ceratopsians with these enormous frills and horns sticking out of their head. Hadrosaurs with these duck-billed quote duck-billed morphology of the bill, and sometimes in some cases they have big crests on their head. These come from a line called Ornithopods, which are just broad-billed animals. There are pachycephalosaurs with big domes on their head, sometimes can get up to about 10 inches thick, and also ankylosaurs, which are these armored tanks that walked around with these bony knobs all over their bodies and heads, and sometimes they have big clubs on their tails. And so you can get a sense for different kinds of defense mechanisms these animals have. I have always thought that this was the superior clade of dinosaurs, subclade of dinosaurs, but many disagree, including Dr. Holtz. I know he's out there, but I've always had a soft spot for Ornithischian dinosaurs. So one of the most interesting things about Ornithischian dinosaurs is that they had these crazy feeding mechanisms. And we know this because of dental microwear studies. This, for instance, is a study by Mallon and Anderson in 2014. And you can see here on these bottom photographs, these scratch marks. These are microscopic views of the surface of teeth. And you can see scratches in different orientations. Some of them are forward and backward, rostrocaudal, some are or mesiodistal in teeth. Some of them are side to side, transverse. And you can kind of see in these charts the kind of the amount of one scratch direction, or compare the one scratch direction from another, and how often or how common they are. But so for instance, here's an ankylosaur, a lot of forward backward motion of the jaw. Basically, this is really its backward motion of the jaw, palinal motion. Hadrosaurs have a mix of palinal and transverse scratches, and ceratopsians do as well. And something about hadrosaurs and ceratopsians especially, they have these huge dental batteries, basically columns and columns of teeth packed together. So hadrosaurs could have over 1,000 teeth in their mouth. And they're packed together and create this solid occlusal surface in which they can pull the jaw backward and curl it out while they're feeding. So, and not only the teeth, but the jaws themselves have these insane adaptations that are just all over the place in Ornithischians. Some have these little triangular muscle attachment for the temporal muscles. Others have a huge coronoid process, which basically increases that mechanical advantage of the temporal muscle. And we'll see that a bit later. Some have these curved tooth rows, just like arching up and down. This is an ankylosaur here. Here's a hadrosaur with a coronoid process. Ceratopsis is a coronoid process. Some have these big beaks that are pointed. Others have much more flat, broader beaks. And also, this jaw joint is actually set lower than the tooth row. This kind of is sort of like what we see in herbivores today, except it's opposite. In large herbivores today, the jaw joint is above the tooth row, but it has pretty much the same function in that when the animal's jaw is closing, all the teeth kind of can come together at once instead of more of a scissor-like fashion that carnivores have, in which their jaw joint are level with the tooth row. So tons of adaptations in herbivores and herbivorous dinosaurs for herbivory. One of my personal favorites is something called the Pre-Denarii Bone. It's this little bone that Ornithischians have that's unique to them only. There's this little tiny bone in the front of the jaw, in the midline, attached to both sides of the jaw, both of the denaries on each side of the jaw. And these predenaries basically form the lower beak, and they come in all shapes and sizes, from square in this hadrosaur form to pointed in ceratopsians to this little bar-like thing in ankylosaurs that basically don't look like they can. They're just like hanging there. There's not much room for articulation with them. So, because of the way that in many Ornithischians the predenarii would have attached, there's a good possibility that they actually had the ability to rotate both sides of the jaw at the same time, medial, or do medial rotation of the lower jaw like this. So imagine you have, the mouth coming in, there's a predenarii in the front. That bone holds these two sides of the jaw together so that they can rotate independently. You think of when you eat your food, like a salad, you don't really think about it, but you're mostly eating on one side. There's a good possibility that these animals could actually feed on both sides of the jaw at the same time. These things are eating all the time, so they just need to constantly be able to eat as much as they can, process as much vegetation as they could. So my Dr. Dave Weissample and I looked at the predenaries across the board in Ornithischians and just kind of categorized their morphotypes, and there's all different shapes and sizes. Again, this little pointed thing that rests on the edge of the mandible to really broad ones that don't look like they articulate. And if you go to a museum and look at these dinosaurs, these predenaries are just kind of like floating there. There's no real perfect way to articulate the Pre-Denarii, except for Ceratopsians, in which they kind of secondarily have a little slot in the Pre-Denarii for the Denaries to fit into, to fuse it up a little more. So this alone, these Pre-Denaries alone could show differences in the amount of medial rotation of the jaw, medial outer rotation of the jaw. So, for instance, there's a slight rotation where there's just a little bit of wiggle room. There is a lot more extreme rotation coupled with a palinal or backward feeding motion, as well as just a secondarily fused condition in ceratopsids, which they just can go straight back, as well as up and down. And here you can see, without the Pre-Denarii, this is a frontal view of an ankylosaur, you can see how it just can rotate like this in these larger animals. And here's an example so this is a Gobihadros. You can see how the mandible would curl inward against that Pre-Denarii. Like that. And then I'm gonna go to the ankylosaur. You can see the same thing. So in ankylosaurs, you can see it pull up and pull back at the same time. They have this like motion that just kind of curls as it pulls up. This is what you see in the tooth wear. So these Pre-Denaries are kind of facilitating, holding that in place, probably with some kind of fibrocartilage in between, so that those Denaries can curl in and out against it. Okay, so along with the Pre-Denarii, Ornithischians are known for another feature that they have, and that's what's known as a buccal imagination. It's this ridge on the lateral aspect, the outside rim of the teeth. And you can see it in most Ornithischians. It's basically like juts outward a little bit from the tooth row. It kind of forms a shelf in some cases, especially in this ceratopsid right here. So the past over 100 years, this imagination was thought to be the insertion of a novel cheek muscle, basically a muscle that bridges between the upper and the lower jaw. Now, the argument for it was, well, these animals needed to hold food in the jaw anyway, so it makes sense that there'd be this muscle here. Problem is, reptiles don't have this new muscle. A buccinator-like thing. A buccinator is a mammalian muscle of facial expression. Okay, it's not a reptilian feature. So the fact that you would put a buccinator on the sides of an Ornithischian jaw basically would mean they would have needed to create a whole new muscle, which is entirely possible. However, looking at going more into the anatomy of it, it doesn't really seem to make sense. I'll get into that a little bit more. But there have also been other explanations for the margination, as, for instance, keratinous beak stretching outward on the lateral aspect all the way back behind the jaw. Maybe that buccinator-like muscle kind of had another orientation in which it just kind of jutted forward, things like that. So it's been up for debate for literally, especially the past few decades, but ever since 1973, when, I'll go back here, when Dr. Galton in 1973 officially proposed that there were cheeks in Ornithischian dinosaurs. So this is kind of a view of basically what would happen what would the animal look like with or without cheeks, okay? And so this is just kind of gives a basic view of, if they didn't have cheeks, either it would be really just flat like this, which is highly unlikely, or it would have this lip-like margin that extends all the way backward. The third option is that if it definitely had cheeks, they would have this flap covering all the side of it. Although, it could be this as well, but the most likely for a cheek muscle would have been this option here. And Morhart in 2009 did a study in which she basically looked at the foramina of the jaw to see, the more foramina there are, the more likely there wasn't some kind of soft tissue structure, but she basically found that there likely was some kind of soft tissue structure, although whether it's a lip or a buccal flap, a big flap on the side of the jaw, it's really unsure. And she very plainly said in her manuscript that, or in her dissertation, that it was not, or I think it was a master's thesis, that it was not. You can't tell for sure, and you really can't. There's not really a good way unless we had a mummy of the animal. But she did an amazing study that gave us a lot of clues into what it might be like in a lot of dinosaurs. So Ornithischian jaw musculature. Now there have been studies that have reconstructed the jaw muscles in Ornithischians, especially. For instance, in 1961, here's Ostrom's study of the duck-billed dinosaurs, hadrosaurs. And up until most recently, the temporal muscles of Ornithischians were said to have attached along this coronoid process. And that's it, just along that coronoid process from the temporal region and not extending any further than that. And here you can see the pterygoid muscle as well. Now, these more recent studies have all said that cheek muscles are probably not likely. It doesn't hold to the extant phylogenetic bracket, meaning all of the animals that are most related that are living today don't show any signs of a buccinator-like muscle, so why would, dinosaurs that are extinct have them at all? These studies have consisted of just muscle attaching to that coronoid process and around that post-Denarii margin. But no cheeks here. Very similar to what theropod dinosaur muscles look like. But I always had an issue with that, just because, if you have the same kind of muscles in an ornithischian as you do in a theropod or a sauropod, then why is it we see so much oral processing? How can something with muscle or anatomy, with the muscle anatomy of a theropod, do something like chew food? Because all those muscles, if you look back here, are constrained to the back of the jaw, which is basically good for pulling the jaw up to close it and not do much palinal feeding. So I then asked the question, what does it take to have palinal feeding, or something called proal feeding even? So before I get to palinal, I'll just briefly talk about proal. Proal is basically a feeding mechanism where you bring the jaw up to occlusion and then you move the mandible forward while in occlusion to chew forward. Okay, so mesially or rostrally, pushing your mandible forward. This is something that elephants do, a lot of rodents do it, as well as the tuatara. Now, I said, okay, these animals are specifically do proal feeding motion. What is it about their muscles that, allow them to do that? Well, right off the bat, you notice that their muscles are actually attaching a lot more forward, underneath the orbit or even past the orbit. So they have this large mass of muscle that's actually extending forward. Especially in rodents, and in tuatara, it's the palatal muscles that are extending forward. So basically, it's this huge bracing mechanism with this big, powerful muscle that can pull the jaw forward. Conversely, in palinal feeding, that you get a similar kind of thing. But incidentally, there is no living animal that has a palinal feeding mechanism that we know of. What we have to rely on is extinct animals. So I've looked at things like Dicynodonts, which are basically these herbivorous relatives of mammals from the Permian Triassic. Basically, before even the dinosaurs showed up, these animals survived and thrived. And also little mammals that aren't alive today called multituberculates that especially have this big blade-like tooth and a muscle attachment that basically ends right in here. And you notice how this is lateral, it attaches lateral to those teeth. So it stretches really far forward and attaches on the outside of the teeth. Same thing with the Dicynodonts. Notice the muscle extending way far forward in these Dicynodonts that had teeth, although most Dicynodonts lost their teeth. This is an earlier one that still had teeth in place. So I said, okay, well, these animals all have muscles that are placed forward in the jaw. And when you look at just the just cranial mechanics in general, it's generally understood that if you have muscles constrained in the back of the jaw, there's a lot of a joint reaction force or force that kind of presses back onto the jaw joint itself that's focused in the back of the jaw. Whereas something that does a lot more, that needs a lot more power, extends that muscle forward to dissipate that joint reaction force and kind of spread it along the mandible a little bit. This is especially helpful in things that chew their food, although you don't necessarily need to chew your food to do this. But I thought, okay, well, can we say something similar for ceratopsians? Because ceratopsians are mainly palinal feeders. They pull their jaw back, ortho too. Ortho means up and down. So they do up and down, but they also pull their jaw back a lot when they're feeding. And I went and I looked at it, and I noticed that Ornithischians, especially ceratopsians, first of all, have this cheekbone that flares out. Okay, is normally things like theropod dinosaurs and sauropods, that side of the jaw is continuous with the cheekbone. But in these Ornithischians, especially ceratopsians, this cheekbone flares outward. And when it flares out, you can see this pocket of air here. It's just empty. Now, in the normal reconstruction of the muscles, those muscles attach to the coronoid process in the back right here. But I thought, well, why isn't it that this whole region isn't filled with something? Because basically, it's not like arteries or nerves are that big that they would go through there like that. So, but you also wouldn't want it to be just a pocket of air. So what was it that goes through? But then I realized there's this buccal imagination that everyone thought was a cheek ridge, but that it actually extends back onto the lateral aspect of the coronoid process too. So it doesn't end in front of that coronoid process. It continues on. It's a shelf that continues lateral or onto the outside of that coronoid process. You can see it here too, and right here. So I said, okay, here's a traditional muscle reconstruction. But if we take that lateral ridge into account, well, first of all, with this original reconstruction, you can see the joint reaction force is all constrained to the jaw joint. These things have massive jaw muscles. You don't want all that force to go against that jaw joint. Otherwise, it's going to hurt a lot in life. It's not going to be very good for its skull. So what I've proposed is that instead of this muscle only attaching onto this part of the coronoid process, what if it actually extends all the way along that lateral margin? Now, this muscle does attach onto the lateral aspect of the coronoid process in a lot of living reptiles today, as well as birds. So why isn't it that it can't extend forward? And it actually does in some things. So I thought, well, that ridge looks like it continues on to where that surface area is. So it's a good chance that this muscle extended forward, just like in Dicynodonts would have, which are also palinal feeders. So this would also make those reaction forces kind of spread across the jaw and pull that jaw backward, just like a Dicynodont would here. And so here's kind of a breakdown of what those jaw muscles look like. Here's the most superficial temporal muscle here, but there's also deeper ones. So if you take this layer away, you can see there are still muscles attaching to that tall coronoid process, which are, really, they're necessary for this animal to have. And they go up and attach all along down here in the temporal region. I looked at ankylosaurs and kind of thought, well, they look like they're doing something similar. They have this ridge as well. And if you look at a CT scan, this was courtesy of Dr. Larry Whitmer, that there's a big tunnel which kind of angles forward. This is where those temporal muscles would have been. And these temporal muscles basically would have stretched forward. And based on what it looks like, and because of the fact that there's this ridge here, I believe it's very likely that a muscle would have stretched forward, just like I mentioned in the ceratopsians it would have. Same thing in hadrosaurs, although hadrosaurs have a much more constrained opening of the jugal. So there's not as much room for that muscle to stick through, but there still is a little pocket. And so that muscle would have come out a little bit, but not as much as things like in ankylosaurs and ceratopsians. But here's the reconstructions in ankylosaurs and hadrosaurs. So these are separate groups of Ornithischians, and I'm not saying that this is something that all Ornithischians have. This is something that seems to be a convergent kind of structure for these derived or very large Ornithischians especially, which incidentally are palinal feeders. ceratopsids, ankylosaurs, and hadrosaurs all have a major palinal component in their feeding mechanism. And so it would make sense that each of these animal groups would have had this muscle that extends forward. So this is a before and after. Here's this banshee-looking Triceratops skull here before with all the muscles, jaw muscles stuck in the back, and here's the newer reconstruction. So, you know, it's a hypothesis, and if it's proven wrong, great. If not, great. You know, it's just something to think about. I always thought that it's not good to, hang on to what is commonly thought. You know, there are many ways that anatomy could have been, especially soft tissue anatomy in things like dinosaurs, which we know nothing about. So it's always great to explore the anatomy and really try to get a sense of what different things could have been, what could have been present. So I did other studies as well. So I did a recent study looking at animal anatomical traits related to muscle anatomy across many herbivorous dinosaurs, looking at the temporal region, so up in here, the adductor chamber, the chamber where all the temporal muscles are sitting, the palate, cornered elevation, this insertion of those temporal muscles, retroarticular process, which is this little process here that those pterygoid muscles, those palatal muscles would have inserted, and other structures as well. And further back, I also did a study looking at the mechanical advantage of temporal muscles in Ornithischian dinosaurs. I did this basic 2D lever arm mechanic methodology in which I took the vector of a temporal muscle and took the moment arm, which is basically perpendicular length from the jaw joint to that vector of the jaw muscle, and took that moment arm and divided it by the output lever, which is basically from the jaw joint to different lengths along the jaw. And with this, I could kind of get a sense of the mechanical advantage of the jaws at different tooth levels, or at different points in the tooth row across Ornithischians, and just kind of compare them and see where they kind of focus their anatomy. So I'll start off with the thyreophorans. So these are things like stegosaurs and ankylosaurs. And right off the bat, when I compare between them, so before I go into it, the left here is the mechanical advantage of the Pre-Denarii, and the cooler the colors are, so things like this, the less mechanical advantage, the smaller the number for the leverage. So mechanical advantage, the value is less. The red, the higher, or the red, warmer colors show the highest mechanical advantage. So in thyreophorans, it's kind of all over the place when you compare between the animals within that clade. But you can notice here a Scelidosaurus, which is this animal here. It popped up before the division of stegosaurs and ankylosaurs. Or at least animals like Scelidosaurus did. But you can see that their jaw is just like really mechanically advantageous throughout the tooth row. It's really efficient throughout that tooth row. You also see a much lower mechanical advantage in ankylosaurs especially. So it doesn't look like they have a lot of power in that jaw. They also incidentally have much smaller teeth. So they aren't really doing as much with the jaw as, say, a ceratopsian would. But they still are doing that palinal feeding motion. We have tooth wear from ankylosaurs that show that. So there is a little bit of processing going on in things like ankylosaurs and stegosaurs, but not to the extent of things like hadrosaurs and ceratopsians. So if you look at their cranial musculature, there are lots of differences you see. So these two are stegosaurs, for instance. And you can notice even between stegosaurs, the Huyengosaurus, it's a Huyengosaurid stegosaur. It has a tooth row that stretches all the way across the jaw, and its temporal muscle actually looks like it might extend a little bit more forward than something, say, like a Stegosaurus. But notice how a Stegosaurus has a much broader temporal muscle than the Huyengosaurus does. So right off the bat, you can see they have very different feeding mechanisms going on. Ankylosaurs, like I was talking about before, they have that kind of tunnel-like adductor chamber, so you can see the muscle kind of stretching forward. So in this study, I looked at a lot of different traits in the animals to just kind of compare. So So here's a stegosaur versus an ankylosaur here. See the very low cornoid process in ankylosaurs, but a much kind of broader and a bit taller cornoid process in stegosaurs, so on and so forth. Things like ornithopods, we have, so if you go, so at the bottom of the ornithopod tree, at the more basal region of the ornithopod tree, you can see that especially in the caudal teeth, the distal teeth in the back of the jaw, they're not very efficient in that region. Their tooth rows, there's not a lot of mechanical advantage. But when you get to things that are like hadrosaurs, so these big duck-billed hadrosaurs that are here, all of a sudden you get this massive increase in mechanical advantage. It shoots up and their values are a lot higher. So they have really powerful jaws, and it evolves with that tooth battery that I was talking about before. They have these massive, just like, shearing mechanisms that they're doing just a lot of cutting probably all throughout the day. They're these massive animals that just needed to eat all the time. You can see, and so I also kind of explored their feeding or jaw musculature, and there are differences in traits in their feeding muscles, but especially I just wanted to focus here, even within groups of hadrosaurs, there are differences. So for instance, here's what's known as Griposaurus. This is big, broad-nosed kind of duck-billed hadrosaur, and they have these really wide temporal regions, much broader temporal muscles that come down attached. Whereas things like Edmontosaurus, that temporal region is much smaller. So the origin of that muscle doesn't allow for as much muscle room, and allow as much room for muscle. I'm sorry, I'm slurring my words a little bit, I guess. Maybe I need to drink some water. But you also see that in this other group of hadrosaurs as well. So, big broad muscle here and much skinnier muscle here. So again, lots of differences. You can see here's that Griposaurus, really large temporal region, versus Edmontosaurus is really tiny. So lots of differences. And we see differences in their tooth wear as well, differences in the amount of palinal versus orthal feeding scratches and things like that. So each of these come with their own adaptations. Marginocephalians, so these included the ceratopsians as well as the dome-headed pachycephalosaurs. You see the same trend in them as you do with hadrosaurs. So especially at the back of the jaw, they have a really low relative bite force or mechanical advantage. They're at the Pre-Denarii, at the front of the beak, their mechanical advantage is a bit higher. So that would mean that they're probably focusing more, at the front of the jaw in their bite. But again, just like in hadrosaurids, in ceratopsids, you see this massive increase in leverage in the lower jaw when basically these large ceratopsids with horns and big frills on their heads, all of a sudden, these also evolved dental batteries, so they need a lot more jaw power to cut the food. So same trend you see as in the hadrosaurs. So from a decreased relative bite force to a much more increased one here. And you see all different types of muscles in them as well. I won't get too much into it because I already talked about ceratopsians, but you can see the trend from a jaw muscle, for instance, that's more caudally restricted here to a much more rostrally, more forward attaching muscle in the big ceratopsid dinosaurs. You can see here the cheekbone isn't as flared out as in big ceratopsid dinosaurs, so it wouldn't have allowed the muscle to extend forward like other animals did. So just lots of different differences there. When you look across the board at Ornithischians, you can kind of see a much more interesting trend. Specifically, the thing I wanted to point out is, first of all, in thyreophorans, like ankylosaurs and stegosaurs, they have really low relative bite forces relative to derived ornithopods and ceratopsids. So you can see they're both cool colors, both at the front of the jaw and the back of the jaw. But when you look between these two, again, like I said before, in ceratopsids, you see this big increase, and in the hadrosaurids, you see the big increase. And when you look at it statistically, now the statistics can't be they're not very robust here, but because the sample size is terrible relative to what statistics should have. But, I just wanted to explore it to see what it'd be like, what you would see. And what I found was that there was no significant difference in the relative bite force between the derived hadrosaurids and the derived ceratopsids, But they are both individually significantly different than their more basal members, like smaller ornithopods versus hadrosaurs, or smaller ceratopsians versus ceratopsids. So they basically convergently created this feeding mechanism that was a lot more efficient. And both of them, incidentally, also evolved a large coronoid process for temporal muscles to attach to. So you see lots of different convergences between the two groups. To explain it mechanically as best I could, so you'll go from a third-class lever in more basal animals. So, for instance, the bite point is located in front of that muscle vector, and here's the jaw joint. You move from that to a second-class lever in which the muscle vector is actually situated in front of some of the bite points. So in this case, it would actually attach lateral to those teeth, that tooth row, and stretch forward. And this automatically greatly increases that mechanical advantage in both of these groups. But they're doing it in different ways. So, for instance, in a lot of hadrosaurs, that angle of the muscle is going further up, but in ceratopsids, it's going down. So they're not they're convergently going to similar leverage, but in different ways. So it's not complete convergence. There's still a lot of differences. So that's what's just fascinating about these animals. Sauropods, Seropotamorphs, so these long-necked animals, I've only done a little bit in my most recent study along with the Ornithischians, but there have been tons of great studies in Sauropotamorph cranial musculature. And you can see even in them, there's lots of big differences in their muscles. For instance, these macronarians like this Camarasaurus and this Giraffatitan or Brachiosaurus-like animal, the temporal muscles stretch out to be a lot larger, like a big fan, versus in diplodocids, they're a lot skinnier and attaching to that coronoid eminence, kind of acting as more of a hinge to bring the jaw upward. And incidentally, that palatal muscle, as I said in the very beginning, is much larger in diplodocids, and that larger palatal muscle orients that palatal muscle to be a lot more vertical rather than diagonal. So this really helps in upward motion of the jaw. Although there's a little, microscopic movements that are happening in the teeth to actually process a little bit, but maybe not microscopic, but just small relative to the size of the skull. But these animals are primarily more ortho feeders, so up and down. So looking at their jaw muscles, again, lots of differences across the board. I won't go into it that much, but you can see here, broader temporal muscles here, much skinnier temporal origin here, but stretching maybe a little bit more forward, a little more rostrally. In dicraeosaurids, their skull actually tilts a lot further back, so it even makes that muscle stretch even more forward. Same thing in titanosaurs, which are a form of macronarian, which are more related to brachiosaurs, incidentally. So titanosaurs and diplodocoids kind of have a bit of convergence in some areas of the skull. Even there's still differences, but it's a little convergence there. You can see here the titanosaur, this is Rapidosaurus, it's kind of tilting its head backwards. So because of that tilt backward, that muscle is now able to extend a lot more forward. And there's an arch in that cheek region so that it would allow that muscle to extend more forward than, say, a diplodocid in which that cheek is really far down, so wouldn't be able to stretch forward as much. So tons of variation amongst all these animals. It's crazy. I also looked at some herbivorous theropods because, believe it or not, there are some herbivorous theropod dinosaurs. And so things like ornithomimids here, they have this fan-shaped muscle, and especially Dinochirus, which is this massive ornithomimid that until a few years ago was enigmatic because we didn't know much about it except for its arms. Now we have a lot, I think most of the animal now, so we have the skull, so we can see what its skull looked like. And interestingly, Dinochirus has a bit of flaring in the side of the skull, whereas other ornithomimids don't. And it tilts back a little bit too, so that it might have actually had a muscle that extends forward a little bit. There are Therizinosaurs, which have these massive jaw muscles, temporal muscles, and Therizinosaurs have been studied a lot, especially by Lautenschlager. Some great studies in Therizinosaurs by him. Oviraptors, they're the these crazy headed animals that are just so bizarre. I still can't wrap my brain around them, but they show a lot of diversity in their jaw muscles as well. The temporal muscle here, for instance, in this oviraptorid is really big, much smaller in canignathids, which have a lot shorter coronoid process, much bigger palatal muscle here versus a much smaller one here. So tons of differences both between and among groups of all kinds of dinosaurs. So, you know, when you look at orthal feeding variants, so some herbivorous dinosaurs are primarily orthal feeders. They have kind of broader temporal muscles, kind of medium-sized pterygoid muscles, palatal muscles. But these are good for really bringing the jaw up and sometimes even curling it inward a little bit, especially the ones with the pre-Denaries. Yes, and also non-hadrosaur iguanodontians have a slightly elevated coronoid elements and palate, so it's kind of transitioning into that more hadrosaurid-like or ceratopsid-like thing or condition, but it still has this basic orthal feeding variant morphology, and you can see how the temporal muscles aren't really stretching forward that much, although it stretches forward a bit in these animals. Another kind of orthal feeding variant you'll see is things like pachycephalosaurs, which I forgot to mention earlier, and diplodocoids. And you can see here the temporal muscles are a lot skinnier in the back, not as much room in the temporal region. So that allows that muscle to extend forward a little bit, and they have these massive palatal muscles attaching onto the side of the jaw here. And this would have helped basically a great bracing mechanism to pull that jaw upward in orthal occlusion. And again, sometimes a bit of curling of the jaw and things like pachycephalosaurs with the Pre-Denarii. So it's just, so to me just looking at these features individually, there's a bit of convergence there, even though they're completely different types of animals. There's still a lot of interesting nuances that make them look a little bit more similar than you would think. And also, of course, the palinal feeding variants that I've paid most attention to. So things like ankylosaurs, hadrosaurs, and ceratopsians. Again, with that flaring of that cheekbone and forward placement of that big jaw temporal muscle. But there are differences, and different kinds of hadrosaurs have different sizes of those adductor muscles and orientations, and muscle vector differences contribute to differences in their mechanical advantage throughout the jaw. So each one has their own individual ecology that their bodies are adapted for. And so, yeah, it's been crazy just looking at all the different kinds of anatomy in these very similar looking animals. And like hadrosaurs, between hadrosaurs and stuff like that. There have also been, there are more and more amazing kind of computer modeling studies that have been coming out more recently in herbivores. I haven't had the pleasure to do studies like this yet, but my great colleagues, including Bell, Button, and Lautenschlager, have done amazing work looking at differences in this skulls and their jaw muscles and reconstructing jaw muscles to see how, again, like those carnivores I showed before, how those differences or affected the strains that you see throughout the skull. And especially things that have similar looking skulls, turns out they have a lot of differences in how those forces perpetuate in the skull. So lots of things to look at. And last but not least, hyoids and tongues are important. We don't have a lot of hyoid bones in the fossil record. They're basically bones in the back of underneath the jaw that hold the tongue muscles, that we have them as well. In some things like ankylosaurs, they're huge, but we don't have them in we don't have them in the fossil record very much. So hopefully we'll get a lot more so we can reconstruct tongues, because they're really important for feeding. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for coming. And guess it's 3:50 now. I'm sorry I didn't get to anything. It looks like I'm still here. Maybe I can. So I'm going to try to see the most from muscles. Why are temporal muscles dominant in Ornithischian dinosaurs and palatal muscles in Sariskians? That's a good question. Palatal muscles in Sariskians, so like in sauropods especially, their feeding mechanism is more orthal. So they just happen to get bigger palatal muscles. There are some Ornithischians with big palatal muscles, like I said, like Pachycephalosaurs. But yeah, there's just, it just depends on the environment they're in. Sorry, I don't think I'll be able to get to any more questions, but thank you so much. And yeah, this was great. Thank you.